Hello, everybody. It is Dr. Petrie. This little exercise for my students is a PowerPoint on a historical narrative, writing historical narrative. This is for a project my students are going to have to do on writing the story of the Jewish people for a 10th grade or ninth and 10th grade world history class at John F. Kennedy High School. All of this material is adapted from the Write Like a Historian series, which was published by Pearson Prentice Hall, ironically in an American history book that I no longer use. Um, but let's get started. First of all, the introduction to the narrative essay. Narrative essay is where you tell a story about a historical event. You blend facts with imagined characters and situations. So it's truth and fiction. Historical narratives describe people who actually lived in events that actually happened. However, they also include fictional people and details that are imagined by the writer. So, historical narratives contain accurate historical events, details of historical places. Typically, they're written in the first person, they make up one person's point of view. Some characters and circumstances are invented by the writer. These could be the character's inner feelings, how they are interpreting the events that are happening to them, what sort of empathy they have for the other people that are in the situation. And lastly, most narratives follow a chronological organization, a sequence from the beginning, middle to end. It might start at the beginning of a historical period and end up at the end of that historical period. So the first part of pre-writing before you start your essay is going to be when you decide on the historical event you will narrate, or you will narrate meaning tell the story of. Then you choose either a real or fictional person to place at the center of your story. So next you're going to brainstorm for ideas and research the background of the event itself. You want to get as many details as possible. This is where people use timelines. This is where people use their outlines from the textbook. People use bubble maps for this. And then here's some ideas for choosing a central character. And you can pick whether or not you're going to go with real people, if you're going to invent fictional characters, or if you're going to have both fictional and real people in this. I'm not going to talk through all these questions. You can read them. You can certainly pause the video and come back to this when you're in the brainstorming part of your planning. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the central character. Um, a lot of writers don't put this in the story, but they'll actually write a biography. They'll actually write some notes on the central character. They'll describe that character and his or her surroundings. Sometimes they make up siblings or parents or other interactions that they imagine this character would have. Who would this character interact with? And most historical narratives use their central character and allow that person to talk about themselves in the first person. This is a very common technique in novels also, to use the first person where they're talking. I this, me that, my that. Um, Also, have your central character describe what's going on during the historical event. They can talk about the setting, they can talk about the time and the place. If you're writing a historical narrative, you have a lot more creative things to go, creative directions to go in. Again, think of this as a story, think of this as a film, as a TV show, and you can imagine other characters in it. So the next step is to chart the narrative sequence. And most historical narratives, like I said, use a sequential or chronological organization. And at some point, you have to decide when your narrative starts and when does it end. Does it start at Lexington Concord at the beginning of the American Revolution, or does it start later on at the Battle of Albany? So, as the storyteller, you get to decide when the narrative starts and when it ends. And usually in Hollywood films, they start in the beginning, they start in the action, so it's very exciting. Next, you want to list the series of events that you want to cover, that you want to talk about in your historical narrative. Your hero can be talking about these events, your hero can be in these events, your hero can be describing them as they happened. So, and then essentially, like in film, they have a three-act structure in all good stories. The first part, the first act, is where you open the narrative, you introduce your main character, you introduce this new world to your readers, and as you're writing, think about these questions. What details put this person in that particular time and place? How does this person feel about the historical event? Why is this story being told? Is your storyteller relating this narrative to a friend? Is it a love letter to an ex-girlfriend or boyfriend? Are they talking to a group of strangers trying to clear up any miscommunications or misinterpretations of the historical event? So a lot of novels are very creative in how they bookend the story. Next, in the middle, you're going to really develop the narrative. This is where you relate the series of events that make up the story. Remember, you want to keep the narrative in the first person. If you add other characters in, that's okay, but you have to remember who the person telling the story is. Who's the hero? Who's the narrator? Who's telling the story? Also, use transitions. First, before, later, the next day. These are tricks that help your audience keep track of time. Every time you switch to a new paragraph or you switch to a new scene, you should use a transition like this. And lastly, the narrative should build dramatically, get more and more intense until it reaches a high point. And throughout your story, you should use powerful and vivid language to intensify the emotions and get people involved in the story. And remember, you want to have an opportunity to show your character's reaction to what happens. They're not just passively letting this happen to them, they're actually living through this historical event. So in your third act, you're going to simply close the narrative. The final paragraphs wind down the action, and the reader should be able to consider what they would have done if they were in the historical figure's shoes. Would they have done the same thing? Would they have made the same decisions? And this kind of gives the reader to reflect about what was the purpose of this story. Is this a huge event that you need to explain and put in context? Is this a tiny little event that you think deserves more press, deserves more attention, and should be in the textbooks? Then you write a good story, and maybe people start reconsidering this facet of history. So, there are some guiding questions that will help you when you're researching a historical narrative. The first is the historical event itself. You should go through these questions. If you're just researching a current event, you can tell the answers to these questions. If you're talking about values, morals, and ethics, you have to make sure to include these two questions in your story. And also, economics. What's it like to be wealthy? What's it like to be poor? These should somehow be addressed in your story. Also, talk about daily life, and then a favorite method is to imagine yourself living in that time and in that place. How do you think you would have fit into this world? What would you have liked living then and there? Why or why not? So, lastly, I'm going to leave you with a little bit of advice on revising. When you're revising a draft, you're trying to polish it up, you're trying to make it very clear. You want to make sure the event is portrayed accurately and clearly. You want to have a lot of detail, but you don't need irrelevant details. So when you go back and you're looking at the draft, question all the details you put in. Do you really need them? Are there some that you could take out? Next, does the narrative establish a clear impression of the storyteller in their world? Also, does the narrative include transitions to help the reader? So are you making the story easy for the reader so they can identify a beginning, middle, and end? Next, you want to revise for tone and style. You want to make sure your storyteller's language is convincing. You want to make sure that you create a good impression of the storyteller. And then you want to make sure your narrative has a lot of emotion in it. Your narrative should make the people care about the story, care about the characters. You're sad when their brother dies. So a lot of people try and make sure the tone is consistent. Like you don't really want to have a funny part and then really, really sad parts. You might have a little humor mixed in for kind of a change. But if your story is sad, a lot of your scenes are going to be sad. And then lastly, of course, you want to make sure you meet all the written language English conventions. Are the sentences complete? Are the words spelled correctly? Are your proper nouns capitalized? Are your sentences punctuated? And my students have the biggest problem separating their big ideas, separating their paragraphs by skipping a line. If you have a lot of white space on your page, wide margins, you skip a line between paragraphs, it makes it so much better for the teacher to actually read. So I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I wish you the best of luck as you prepare your historical narratives on the history of the Jewish people. Think about who your heroes are going to be. Think about what time period you want to set your story in. Are you going to be a time traveler who goes in and out and talks about the history of the Jewish people over 3,000 years? Or are you just going to talk about the olden days? Good luck on the assignment. Have a great day.